Hello, it's Berlin briefing time. I'm your host, Michaela Küfner, and we're recording this in a week where Ukraine and Russia have once again exchanged drone attacks. The EU Parliament has confirmed a new European Commission, and Angela Merkel published her long-awaited memoirs, which raises the question, is it all Angela Merkel's fault? Putin, his war on Ukraine, the rise of the right. It's Thursday morning, and with me here is Judy Dempsey and Michael Rühle, who is a defense analyst. But we'll start with you, Judy. You've been quite a critic of the current government. But is it all Angela Merkel's fault?
There's been continuity, actually, even before Angela Merkel became Chancellor. Before that, there was Gerhard Schröder, the Social Democrat, and the three chancellors, even Olaf Scholz, Social Democrat of the coalition, they've generally, until recently, pursued a pro-Russia policy. And this has been a German tradition. Merkel certainly pursued it. Gerhard Schröder consolidated it before Merkel. And it took Olaf Scholz quite some time, actually, to break out of this special German-Russia relationship, largely because of Russia's second major invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
Well, this week, for the first time, we actually heard from Angela Merkel explain in some factual detail her course on Russia. But I just want to briefly go back into the year 2005. It had just become clear after her narrow election victory that Angela Merkel would indeed go on to become Germany's first female chancellor. Lots of people in that press room, many people asking questions on policy. And then there's a slightly younger Judy Dempsey asking this. Let's take a listen.
Sie werden Kanzlerin des Deutschland. Wie geht es Ihnen? Wirklich, wie geht es Ihnen? Bitte.
Ja, also erstens, mir geht es gut.
So you ask, so how are you doing? How are you feeling? And then she hesitates and she says, well, first of all, I'm good. And we just heard from her, actually, that this was a huge moment of triumph for her, and that every time she got re-elected, which was 3 times, she felt, look, I'm the first here. I'm the first woman chancellor. So how much of an aha moment did you have on Angela Merkel as she was presenting her memoirs this week?
Well, the memoirs really are not terribly revealing. I think we were expecting much more detail, not so much gossip, because she's not a public figure when she was Chancellor to gossip. But I think we expected far more insights, the nitty-gritty of politics, her relationship with Putin, the whole saga over Nord Stream, the gas pipeline. And we sort of got a kind of vindication of her 3 terms as Chancellor, rather than kind of any kind of insights or criticism of what could have been changed. And maybe some will be disappointed by it, but that's how she is, quite factual, doesn't give way to emotional outbursts or any kind of sort of intense scrutiny of her 3 terms.
There was actually a sense of disappointment, I can confirm, also here in the Berlin bubble of correspondence. And I do want to draw up that soundbite of Angela Merkel where she responds exactly to that perceived lack of self-criticism. Let's take a listen.
Of course, I know that this is all controversial, but there is no point in me now saying what I did was all wrong, that all of a sudden I've realized it. It's just not true. And why should I have to do that? Is there any merit in that?
So no merit in self-criticism. Looking back, does it help in the situation right now? I mean, you mentioned Nord Stream. There she was actually, she had a clear logic there. You know, one can have a different opinion, but her logic was, look, if we stop talking to Vladimir Putin, if we stop having these economic relations, things will only get worse pretty fast. Although she did admit, yes, it was because of cheap gas. She wanted that for the German economy. And she actually insisted for a very long time, I remember this reporting on her, that this was a purely business enterprise. And only very late she actually admitted that it was also a political project. And now in hindsight, her argument is it was political all along. It was to keep that relationship stable. Do you buy into this?
Well, history shows that we shouldn't buy into it. And the tradition of the German relationship with Russia has been always this kind of motto, change through trade. And this never materialized. No matter how much the German business and the lobbies did trade with Russia, it never led to any kind of, I wouldn't even say democratic change because that's too radical, but it didn't lead to a trust where you could actually deal with the kind of issues that needed to be raised. For instance, economic dependency on gas, the use of gas as a security weapon, the use of gas and energy as blackmail. And actually what successive German governments did with Russia was increase the economic dependence on Russia at the expense of Eastern Europe. And I think this is a very interesting trait among successive chancellors in Germany, that they looked at Eastern Europe, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Armenia, whether it's Georgia, whether it's Belarus, through the prism of Russia. And there are some now in the Social Democratic Party and in the opposition Conservative Christian Democrats that still believe that, oh, well, it's not that they hanker after the old days with Russia, but nevertheless there's a feeling that Eastern Europe is viewed through the prism of Russia, through how the Kremlin reacts.
The counter-argument is, of course, that Germany can't escape its geographical location, that there always has to be some form of accommodation, some form of relationship with Russia. But what I find quite striking is that you made the argument that there's a realization that change through trade doesn't work. That's also a realization that Angela Merkel came to in relationship with China, actually, although she very reluctantly admitted that towards the end of her chancellorship, that change simply didn't take place. That was a factual realization as well. So what should be the lesson for a future German government? Because we will see political change. I mean, that is on the cards. There's elections in February. This coalition right now that has just broken up described itself as an Übergangskoalition, as a kind of a coalition of transition. But the question is, transition to which political change?
Politics has become very complicated, and so has the whole issue of economic dependence and globalization. You get a hint of this from Angela Merkel, that what happened under her reign, and indeed before, was Germany became dependent on China for trade, it became dependent on Russia for energy, and it became increasingly dependent, as always, on the United States for the security umbrella. These kind of dependencies actually create a kind of intellectual laziness. It also prevents diversification, and it creates a dependence which actually can be used against German interests. So any incoming chancellor will have to look at these dependencies and consider what is the best interest for diversification, but also the best interest for Germany. And clearly, total dependence, and this is what happened with China, is coming back to damage actually the German economy. It actually prevented reform. It actually didn't wake up the German political elites to the fact that Germany is facing deindustrialization. And because of the competition from China, now the economists here in Germany certainly realise that the old economic model is over. That hasn't been tackled because of these dependencies.
I'd like to bring in Michael Rühle on this, who's a defence analyst now, but for 3 decades was at NATO in Brussels. So, Michael, can you just tell us, when you're listening to this, when you hear of intellectual laziness, you must have been at the sharp end if that analysis is completely true. Do you share it, would be my first question. And what did this mean for those past 2 decades, one can say, in terms of defense planning at NATO?
Well, intellectual laziness is a great term, and I subscribe to it as well. I think this is the result, as Judy rightly says, about the result of a number of developments which seem to go all in the right direction until they hit the snag. And this is a problem we are now all facing, not just Germany. But in terms of defense planning of NATO, of course, NATO has started to reorient itself since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea, towards its initial core business of collective defense and deterrence. For 2 decades, we were thinking in terms of crisis management abroad rather than protecting Europe at home. So this is a collective guilt, if I may say so. We were all a little bit lazy intellectually. But it is true that Germany, in my view, as a German in NATO, did not come forward with too many ideas about the evolution of NATO. I think there was a sense of things go their way, whether we are massively involved or not. And as Judy says, the US, of course, calling the shots in NATO. We always assumed that the US would come up with the good ideas. We don't have to.
Well, the US calling the shots, that's a really interesting one, because Angela Merkel is now blamed single-handedly with having prevented the path towards NATO very early on, both for Ukraine and also for Georgia. And essentially, she's being accused by Volodymyr Zelensky pretty much directly that this robbed Ukraine of its path to stability and towards the European Union. This is something Angela Merkel admits she prevented it, but she says she had a very good reason for that. And I have to say, her book launch gave us more of an insight than the almost 800 pages of her biography on this one. Let's take a listen.
We had a situation where some maybe hoped that a decision to accept Ukraine into NATO would be enough to deter the Russian president. I did not believe that, and that's why I was against it.
So she sticks by it. What do you make of it?
Her answer is actually it falls short of a different reality and a different promise and a commitment that the United States and several European countries promised Ukraine in the Budapest Memorandum in the early 1990s. In return for giving up its nuclear arsenal, Ukraine was guaranteed security guarantees, literally security guarantees, and they didn't materialize. So we have let down Ukraine. This is the first point. Secondly, NATO officials, EU officials, Angela Merkel, they all say, oh, well, we will stand by Ukraine, firstly. And secondly, as NATO Secretary Generals keep repeating, oh, well, every country has the independent right to decide if they want to join NATO, assuming they reach the right standards. Well, Ukraine has an extraordinary military force now, well-equipped, well-trained army and so on. Why won't we admit it to NATO? Why? Because, as I said earlier, we always look at this part of Europe through the prism of Russia. Yes, Russia has nuclear weapons. Well, so has some countries in Europe, not suggesting they will be used. But this is a kind of blackmail, and it's actually undermining our so-called rhetoric about recognising the independence and sovereignty of countries to choose which direction they want to go.
I just want to bring Michael Rühle because, again, right now, NATO would not be able to admit Ukraine, of course, because it is involved in an active conflict. That's not possible under NATO's own terms. But Angela Merkel also argued that back then she felt just simply allowing these countries onto the path could have sparked an attack by Russia and would have tested the alliance even before Ukraine was a member. And she felt that for her, it was a no-go. She would not have sent German troops to defend Ukraine at that point in time. And her feeling also was that NATO wouldn't have done that. Michael Rühle, do you share that assessment? And what is the thinking in NATO today? Was this really the original sin that left us in this situation that we are in today?
I have to say I'm siding with Merkel here because indeed the Merkel is in good company because as we now know, for example, William Burns, who is now the director of the CIA, who was at the time the American ambassador to Russia, wrote a memo which has been declassified recently and where he basically said, to his own administration, don't do that. Don't offer membership in whatever form to Ukraine.
Although President George W. Bush was all up for it.
Yes, of course. But the people who knew a little better said, don't do that. That's as Burns said in this memo, this is the brightest of all red lines for Russia. And I think, remember, a year before the Bucharest summit, Putin delivered his famous or infamous remarks at the Munich Security Conference. So in a way, he already started or described what we then call the new Cold War. And then a year later, we are admitting, semi-admitting, I would say, two countries that are way far away from any realistic chance of joining at that time, 2008. We inviting them to NATO. I think that was not a very smart move by the US, but of course, Merkel, she said in her memoirs, my favorite solution would have been not to have any mention of membership in this Bucharest context. However, Bush had already gone public before, so there was no way that there wasn't Merkel's view would prevail. So they produced a rather awkward consensus result, which is we invite you, but we don't tell you when. But this means we earmarked Ukraine and Georgia as members of a future sphere of Western influence. And if you know how Putin thinks, how Putin and some of his entourage are thinking, then this was indeed a kind of a mortal sin that NATO committed at the time. Today, it's a different matter, because today, as Judy says, we have a war going on. There will be hopefully some sort of peace deal next year. Let's hope Trump is actually delivering, and Putin wants it too. Then the question is, what do we do with Ukraine? And then I personally would argue, for many reasons, bring them as soon as you can into NATO. But in 2008, it was not a very smart idea.
And that brings us into the here and now, because what is the thinking right now? What is the planning taking place? The natural deadline at the moment is, of course, the 20th of January, when Donald Trump becomes US president again. He's vowed to end this conflict within 24 hours. Now, we keep talking to politicians here. There's a lot of guessing going on, but NATO thinks in terms of scenarios, Michael. So how many scenarios are being planned?
Well, I don't think that there's much you can plan at this stage, because Trump, as we all know, is quite unpredictable. It's interesting to see now what kind of people he's nominating for which kind of jobs. I think it was a very smart move by the new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, to go to see Trump at Mar-a-Lago and to sort out maybe a few basics, so that that Trump has at least an idea what the Europeans may think about such a deal. But in any case, it's clear that if you have a deal, there need to be some forms of security guarantees, assurances, whatever you may want to call it, for Ukraine. And whether these come through NATO, or whether the membership of NATO, or whether these come through individual allies, expressing their willingness to support Ukraine in times of need, that remains to be seen. That will all be a matter of negotiation. It will be particularly difficult because the Russians will, of course, hark back to the Istanbul talks and say, well, Ukraine at the time, of course, this was a weird situation for Ukraine, but at the time, Ukraine accepted a solution outside of NATO. The Ukrainians will rightly say, no, that was under pressure, so don't take this at face value, but we will have very difficult times ahead of us.
What do you make of what we're seeing right now happening in Russia? There's this new interballistic missile being tested by the Russians, all these threats, the change of the nuclear doctrine, which essentially makes it legally much easier for Russia to respond nuclear, even in cases where it's not attacked directly by a nuclear force. So it's basically tailored towards NATO countries' support of Ukraine. And of course, a lot of other hybrid. I mean, how hybrid has this gone already? Are we already at the center of a hybrid war here in Europe?
Well, on the missile issue, I don't think that this is too worrying. Russia is trying to keep the war regional. They bring in North Koreans and whatever, but they want to keep the war regional. That's their only chance to reach their goal of dominating Ukraine. So they need to deter NATO and other countries from supporting Ukraine more. And that's what the threats are all about. The problem is they have threatened so many things and drawn so many red lines, which we have always crossed, that it's very difficult for them now. They're running out of options to threaten us. So they manipulate the doctrine. They send a medium range missile where it makes no sense, but they want to show that they still have some options left. The second question,
Is how hybrid this is, because we're now seeing that German journalists are being expelled. We're seeing a British national basically paraded in front of cameras who fought on the Ukrainian side in breach of international law, clearly. What do you make of that?
Well, this is hybrid, as we used to say when we started to dabble in this subject at NATO. Hybrid is the weapon of the weak. You cannot move forward militarily, so you hit your target with other means than direct military means. And Russia is using a huge array of tools and instruments to destabilize the West. I don't think it works very well, but it's a tool they have, a strategy they obviously prefer. What do I make of it? Well, we have to respond to it, but not by calling for military action or, invoke Article 5 of NATO or anything like that, but simply analyze each case as a sui generis case and then respond. We have responded. Remember the Novichok incident in the UK, where we not only called out Russia, but also expelled lots of diplomats from our countries. There are other ways we can do cyber stuff. We can also do stuff like that. But we should stop admiring what they're doing and just look at ways to counter this. And there are ways to counter it.
Judy, you keep nodding. I mean, this is kind of the professional security analyst take on it. This collective we, of course, includes the politicians as well. Do you feel that Germany, as a key country in the European Union, is doing its homework right now? Because after all, we are in the middle of an election campaign. It feels like Germany is very preoccupied, isn't it?
Germany is very preoccupied. But as Michael says, what we are witnessing in Europe is a hybrid war waged by the Kremlin. And it's a hybrid war, cybersecurity, attacks of all sorts, disinformation, misinformation, funding political parties. And we see the situation here between the far-right Alternative for Germany and the Wagenknecht alliance, that they are pro-Russian, they're anti the war in Ukraine, they're anti-NATO, they're more than a tinge of anti-Americanism, Eurosceptic, the whole anti so many things. And the role of any German leader and the role of any leader in the European Union must say openly to its public, this is what is at stake. And what is at stake is the stability, our democracy and our values. These have to be really spelt out instead of running away. And I think it's something much more fundamental, Michaela. I think it's the politics of fear. Mm-hmm. I think many leaders in the EU member states, except the Baltic countries and Poland, the Czech Republic, they are afraid. And they are afraid because Western Europe was always and is under the security of the American security umbrella. But Eastern Europe comes from a different tradition of occupation since 1945, and which ended 1990. 1990 is not far away. So the memories there of occupation, which actually shows how the European Union member states are divided over what strategy to take towards Russia and indeed Ukraine.
Yeah, but it's interesting. It's not just an East-West divide. You also have Hungary, which has the same kind of historic memory of occupation, leaning strategically towards Russia where it suits itself. But I mean, we just saw in the United States that the Democrats, Kamala Harris, on that platform of democracy is at stake. Frankly, she didn't get anywhere. It was a completely different issue that Donald Trump played into, that gained him an overwhelming success that none of the pollsters had actually really seen, and the political bubbles hadn't really seen either. So why should it work in Europe?
There's an intrinsic intellectual problem in Europe. And the intellectual problem rests with the think tanks and the commentators and the bubbles. That we all more or less think the same in the liberal sense. We have to defend democracy and everything. But we leave an awful lot of people behind. And Trump's message was for actually the working people of the United States. Kamala Harris, she went on about the middle class. In fact, it was Joe Biden, the outgoing president, who was the last Atlanticist. And Trump is no Atlanticist, and Kamala Harris would have been no Atlanticist either. So it begs the question, what is the role of Europe when Donald Trump enters the White House? Should we strengthen what's called the European pillar inside NATO? Should we unite? Should the European Union move towards more integration? These are huge issues and we keep talking about them and very little gets done.
Michael Rühle, can you burst our intellectual bubble here on this one?
I think Judy's right. There are people who are left behind, but I would also be cautioned of this reflex that whenever something happens that we don't like, it was part of a Russian hybrid sinister plot. We are struggling. Our nations are struggling. Our economies are struggling, and this all leads to political outcomes that we may not like the elections in East Germany recently. But it's not always some outside actor who does that. Sometimes it's intrinsic problems that we have in our own societies and economies. On Trump, yes, it's going to be difficult again with him, as it was in his previous term, and I have the scars to show that. But we got along in the end. NATO did not suffer too much, and Trump now legitimately can boast that he got the Europeans to spend more on defense, something the Europeans are now saying, even without Trump, we should do it because Putin will help a little here. So in a way, there's still ways to get along. NATO has been rightly called a transatlantic bargain, and we must make sure that the bargain remains fair to both sides. Trump belongs to the school of thought that says the bargain is unfairly distributed, and the burden is unfairly distributed, and we're paying too high a cost for this arrangement. So we Europeans have to tell them, okay, we understood the message. We are spending more on defense. We are to keep the transatlantic bargain favorable to both sides, and that's exactly what Rutte is trying to do.
We also saw in Angela Merkel's biography that Angela Merkel, she doesn't gossip much, but the details she gives us about Donald Trump is very much that he's a zero-sum kind of person, something everybody's already been speaking about. So she reaffirmed that. I just want to highlight one more issue, and that's migration. First of all, because it's Angela Merkel's legacy, but also it plays a key role in all of these societies we're speaking about. It's the moment in 2015 where the far-right Alternative for Germany party was essentially on its way into political oblivion, and then made a comeback because Angela Merkel refused to close the borders. And now the AfD, it actually, historically, in hindsight, laid the groundwork for an AfD being in position right now to ask the war and peace kind of question, because this is something that we're seeing in the German election campaign very prominently. And we got the closest to an explanation so far from Angela Merkel at her book launch on that decision not to close the borders. And I just want us all to listen to that.
I don't reproach myself or would say my decision back then was wrong. I wasn't the one that came up with this migration policy. The AfD gained support because so many people came to us, that's true. But I also had to think of what the alternative would have been.
So the alternative, and she didn't go into much detail, could have been dead people on the streets, ugly scenes at the border. She didn't want to go there. That's why she took this decision. Is there an inevitability of history?
Merkel's decision was a humanist one, a moral one, and an ethical one. And she deserves huge praise for doing this. Perhaps, given the huge numbers, Germany wasn't ready for it, and certainly she got very little assistance from the European Union. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think looking back, and I think Angela Merkel, it comes out sort of in her book, that the European Union has been dragging its feet over an asylum policy, over migration policy, and I think Merkel just could see the deaths, could see the tragedies, and she took this extraordinary, brave decision, and she's right on this clip, that she has no misgivings about this, nor should she have. The ground could have been more prepared, but that's the way it is.
She actually faults the Green Party with not having taken steps to then limit migration. Michael Rühle, I just want to finally ask you, in the cold light of defense analysis, how much of a security issue is migration going to be in the future? Because we're no longer talking about migrants coming from Syria, from active war zone. We're potentially talking about millions of migrants coming from Ukraine.
Yes, indeed. I mean, going back to Merkel for 1 second, it shows the whole AfD issue and the elections in Eastern Germany. It shows how foreign policy, migration, domestic policy are intertwined. And if now coalitions in Eastern Germany come together where foreign policy decisions are put into the party program or into the coalition treaty, then you realize that you cannot separate neatly these different subjects anymore. And I think given all that, Merkel maneuvered quite well. The fear of massive immigration has been, I think, haunting many countries in Europe. It's haunting the United States. We can see how that goes. Also one of the reasons why Trump was reelected, because Biden was not seen as strong enough in protecting the southern border of the United States. So we will see migration becoming a bigger security policy issue. I hope, though, that does not mean that it becomes a military issue, because that's the last thing in the world we should try to think of military solutions to such a problem.
Michael Rühle, and that's where we'll leave it today. Judy, I just want to ask you, what's your biggest hope and fear going into the next couple of months, and particularly the Trump 2 presidency?
The fears are the economic situation in Germany. A weak German economy is very bad for the European Union, and since it's very bad for the European Union, actually it gives Trump the upper hand, especially over tariffs, firstly. Secondly, it's very hard to know how Trump will deal with NATO. As Michael Rühle said, it depends on his advisors. Also, it is the transatlantic bargain, and bargains require compromises and actually some way of cooperating. So it's a mixture of hopes, uncertainty, and a little bit of fear about the German economy.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Judy Dempsey. Thank you, Michael Rühle. And certainly here at Berlin Briefing, we will be unpacking that over the coming months and the coming years, potentially. This is Berlin Briefing. We'll be back next week, and you'll find us on YouTube at DW News, on dw.com Berlin Briefing, and on all major podcast platforms once a week from now onwards. Also check out our DW Berlin Briefing newsletter that comes out every Tuesday from me, Michaela Küfner. Thank you very much.